Hey everybody, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and on today's episode, we're gonna get the motor finished, get it assembled, and then maybe even drop it into the engine bay. Alright everyone, welcome to this episode of Operation Bad Wolf, and it is part 3 of the engine build portion of this series. Today we'll be putting the clutch housing on, we'll be putting the clutch in, the flywheel in, I'm going to put the radiator back on the other side, and then hopefully, if we have enough time, I'll be dropping the motor in the engine bay on the Mini, which should be pretty cool. It'll be nice to get that back where it belongs and getting this project towards the end and towards its completion. Now where we left off last time was I was actually putting on the rear main seal, which is this seal right here, and a gasket around my clutch housing. Now unfortunately when I put that rear main seal in there, it tore and it was pretty frustrating, but it is kind of the name of the game when you're putting a rear main seal in. These seals have a special tool that you can use to put them in. That should be popping up in the corner here so you can get an idea what I'm talking about. However, I don't have that tool, and I am going to show you guys how to do this if you don't have that tool, but what I would recommend is picking that tool up. It's way easier to do this job with it. And that part can be picked up at 7 Mini Parts. The link is in the description below. So let's head out to the motor. Let's get started on this. All right, to start off today, the first thing we need to do is take this back apart. So as you can see, the clutch housing is back on the motor here. And this was when I tried to put the rear main seal in before. Didn't work out so well. So we just got to unbolt this. We got to take the gaskets off, and then we'll take that rear main seal out of there and put the new one in. All right, so I forgot to take a video of the rear main seal getting put on, but the way that this works, you take either your rear main seal tool and you press it in, hammering it in here, and it slides it down into this face here, or what you do without a tool is you take a socket and you kind of work it down in, you hammer the socket, you don't hammer the actual rear main seal, otherwise you could damage it. Now, when you're putting this back on, once you've verified that you have your thrust washer there, you're going to install your gasket. And in my case, I measured how much float I had on my idler gear here. And in order to do that, I had to install this gasket. But when I took this back off, I had to destroy the old gasket that came off. So the main thing is that I want to make sure that I use the exact same gasket. Otherwise, you'll end up with an incorrect amount of float, and then you'll have to remeasure and re-shim that whole system again. Then the next step is pretty simple. You take your clutch housing here, you put the primary gear in the main seal on the housing, and this will allow you to kind of set it in place and make sure that it's in good placement. It doesn't bend up any of that seal. And then you install both the primary gear and the actual housing at the same time. Press that on, and then you're going to also you'll also install your C-clip on your primary gear here. And that does its job of retaining the actual primary gear. As you can see, it's spinning free there. Then we do the job of tightening down all our bolts. All right, so now all of the nuts and bolts are on there. My primary gear is still spinning freely, but it is retained in place exactly where it should be. And now it's time to put the clutch on. All right, so this part is a little bit challenging. The only reason this is something that's kind of difficult to accomplish is that you actually have to kind of assemble this as you're bolting it up. Now, this is not the case for all clutches. The clutch I've got is called a pre-verto clutch. And what that means is it's kind of like 3 different pieces. I mean, the other one is too, but This gets assembled in 3 different pieces, where the other clutch can be assembled kind of in one go. Now this is the flywheel and clutch and everything that was on the car before. I'm going to be keeping that because I'm a fan of the Preverto clutch. It's stronger overall and is going to hold up for a longer amount of time. But you have your pressure plate here, you have your flywheel here, and hold that up for you. You can see the inside of the flywheel. Then you have your clutch disc. Now the way that this works is that these 3 go together like so. And then you have your whole unit. So you have your clutch in between, and then your flywheel and your pressure plate separated. Now, the way this slides on is pretty much as I'm holding it right now. So you've got your kind of puckering end out the front here, your clutch disc, and then the pressure plate. Now, the key with this is to kind of make everything go on at the same time, and it can be kind of difficult because the flywheel, pressure plate, everything likes to fall apart just like that while you're doing this. All right, so just to kind of recap what I just did, I put the pressure plate on, I put the clutch disc on, kind of centered it, and then I pushed the flywheel itself on, kind of centering it with these teeth right here. Now, there's probably going to need to be a little bit of adjustment here to make that work. Next thing up is to press in your kind of special washer thing. I don't even know what that's called. And then work the actual bolt down on there. Now, sometimes this will kind of require a little bit of fiddling to make it fit just right. But eventually everything will line up and you can get this tightened down on there. Now, tightening down this bolt can be a little bit difficult because the flywheel is going to want to move while you are tightening this down, which you obviously don't want it to do. Now, the torque spec for this flywheel bolt is from 110 to 115 foot-pounds, which is quite a lot. You're going to need a lot of force on this thing. But if you think about it, this bolt here is doing a lot of work on your motor. This is really holding on some of the most important stuff in your car. Now, in order to do this, in order to tighten this down, what I like to do is stick like a punch inside and grab one of the teeth of the flywheel, and then you should be able to torque this down without too much fuss. Now, as you can imagine, this is also one of those jobs that is a little easier with a friend if you have one who can come and hold the flywheel or torque this down for you. That is all torqued down. Now, the last thing I like to do is bend the lips up on this washer here. That is going to help tighten that up and hold it in place. Now, it's at this point that the engine becomes suddenly a lot harder to turn, because if you think about it, all your pistons are connected, your drive line, your drive system is pretty much connected, as well as this heavy-ass flywheel over here. So the last thing that we're going to be doing is reinstalling the clutch diaphragm on here, and that's pretty straightforward. But in order to do that, you're going to need these straps. And this is where things, I would say, they don't get tricky, but you just need to make sure you're putting all these on, and this is going to allow the clutch to actually actuate. All right, so now we have our clutch assembled, and that's pretty exciting. The last thing that we need to do is put the walk on here. Unfortunately, I can't put my walk on yet because, well, I haven't gotten it painted yet. So I'm gonna have to do that real quickly, and then I'm gonna check back here. It'll only take a second. And there we have it, a freshly painted walk. And this walk has the job of covering your clutch as well as actuating the clutch, because there's a beam that's not in here right now. I'm gonna have to put that in that actually actuates the diaphragm of the clutch. So as you can see, that's not right. Gotta rotate that around a little bit. And there we go. That's how that goes on. So I find that it's a little bit easier to put the whole walk and clutch assembly together external of the motor and then put the walk on. So let's take a trip back into the workroom and I'll show you guys how to put that together. All right, so this part's not really that difficult. It's about just checking to make sure that the parts you're putting back on the car are in good shape and that everything goes on in the way it should. So you have something called a release bearing, and it looks something like this. Mine is still in pretty good shape, so there's no reason to need to replace this. But if you do need to replace this, I actually have a whole video covering exactly how to replace this release bearing. But the short of it is that this goes on the inside of your walk, like so. And as you can see, the inside of my walk is still pretty dirty. And it slides through this hole right here. I think I got a little paint in there that's keeping that from going in. Alright, and so once that comes through, it should move pretty freely. Mine doesn't quite yet because there's a little bit of paint left over there. There we go. That moves up and down nice and free. And let's clean the end of this off a little bit. And then what we'll do is we'll take our actuating arm, and there are different lengths of actuating arms like this. So mine, in my case, is made for a pre-verto clutch. I'm going to have a long rod here, but in a verto clutch, which is actually what this housing used prior to me installing it on my motor, you're going to have an arm that's much shorter, and your clutch slave cylinder sits a lot closer to the actual articulation point. Now, for whatever reason, somebody put a little spacer on this little like catch screw. This screw helps to prevent this beam from falling down too far, and like so. You know, this bolt goes right here. Let's see if I can show you that. Bolt goes right here and helps prevent that from going down any more than it should. That spacer, however, with my setup is not going to work out. So I took the spacer off. I'm going to return this bolt here. We're going to tighten this down a good bit. The key here is we don't want our clutch to be engaged until we put this on the car and we start adjusting this a little bit later. All right, so let's talk about what's actually happening here. So I'm putting my actuating arm right here into the clutch release bearing. So what happens is when the clutch gets pressed, this arm actually is articulating this direction, and it's pressing this bearing down in onto the clutch and actuating the clutch. And then once there is no pressure on your clutch master cylinder and your clutch slave cylinder, it comes back up and releases that pressure and disengages the clutch. So that's pretty cool. It's pretty simple. We do need to put a pin right in here, and I need to find that. And then we've got a nut that goes on the end of this here that will help us adjust that once it's on the car. So let's do that. That's all reassembled here. We've got our arm. It's got virtually no play in it right now, which is not the end of the world, but it's definitely something that we're going to have to adjust a little later. And but for right now, we have the ability to go ahead and put this walk on our engine. All right, and now at this point, it's a pretty simple job of matching up the shapes like a giant adult Lego and bolting this up. Now, I'm going to be using new hardware for this because I like using new hardware wherever I can. So it's at this point that we only really have a couple things that we need to do before the motor's ready to go back in. The first of which is adjusting this rocker assembly here. Now, this is something that I've done many times in my videos, so I'm not going to cover that in a lot of detail. Basically, I need to set the valve clearance between the rocker assembly and the valve. And then after that, we'll be putting on the radiator and all of that stuff, and then we'll be ready to drop this back in the engine bay. All right, so now at this point, I've got the other side sorted out. Basically what I had to do was kind of sand down some of the inside of the housing. It was just bottoming out on the flywheel. I think that it's just partly because this is a 1300 flywheel going into a Verto box. It's not really the end of the world, just a little bit of shaving had to take place, and now we are in good shape. So the next thing that we're going to move on to is actually setting all the rest of the stuff on the right side. Now, one thing I didn't show you guys me doing was setting the valve lash, and the reason I haven't showed that is because I have gone over that a couple times in my videos, and also there's a wonderful video by Steveston Motor Co. that they go into a lot of detail about setting that valve lash. So if you haven't seen that, check it out. There should be some links popping up in the corners of this video. Now, as you can see here, I've got my water pump on, I've got my lower radiator hose connected on the top, and then I have the lower radiator bracket here. Now with my Mini and this motor, I have found that it is much easier to put the radiator, fan, and everything on outside of the car and then lower it all down into the engine bay. And that's due primarily to the fact that my Mark I body has a kind of cowl around the right side of the body that creates kind of like an enclosure around the radiator, and that makes it quite difficult to get things kind of mounted and set up properly and tightened down in there. So as long as you're extra careful when you're lowering it in, you can actually lower it in with the radiator connected. So first up, we got to put the pulley on, then we got to put the fan on, then we have to put the radiator on with its lower bracket. So I'm going to grab that stuff and I'm going to show you a few tips about this that are pretty important. All right, so first up is your pulley. This is pretty straightforward. It goes on pretty much only one way. You're going to want to do your best to line up those holes now. It's going to be a little bit easier if you can line them up here before you put the fan on. And then you have your fan. All right, so next up we have our fan. Now you probably saw me just spend a lot of time cleaning this, and I don't really care for it to be totally perfect. As long as it functions, that's the main thing. But one thing that you're going to want to take note of when you're looking at these fans, because in my opinion it can be a little counterintuitive which side would be facing out and which side would be facing the motor. Now you look at this side of the fan, it's nice and pretty. You look at this side of the fan and you see all the ribbing and everything. This is just a standard plastic fan. My understanding is that the plastic fans are more efficient and they are quieter. Now, I don't know how much merit that is because I've never actually had the opportunity to test that myself. So take that for what it is. It's you know, just what I have heard. That said, this has worked really great for me over the years and I'm just gonna stick with it. Now, on these fans, it actually says engine side on the side that faces the motor. And you'll notice the pretty side is the side that faces inwards towards the motor, and then this kind of uglier side faces out towards the radiator. Personally, I think it's counterintuitive. Maybe that makes sense to you guys. Additionally, if you have your fan belt, now is a good time to go ahead and stick that on there. Just set it into place. Obviously, without your alternator, it's not going to get tight right now. So, engine side, facing the engine, and then we're going to tighten this up with 4 bolts. Now it's important for these bolts that you don't forget your washers, because if these bolts come out, it's going to get really rattly and it's basically impossible to get in here without taking the radiator off. Alrighty everybody, we have a new radiator here. Just like that. It was magic. Just appears out of nowhere. And by out of nowhere, I mean thank you so much, 7 Mini Parts, for the beautiful 2-core radiator that is going to fit perfectly on my Mark I Mini. Now keep in mind, I could have gone with some fancy aluminum radiator, and I didn't for a couple reasons. First off, the 2-core radiator that is actually made by Mini Spares, sold by 7 Mini Parts here in the United States. This 2-core radiator is really, really robust. It works really well. In all of the North Carolina summers that I've had here with this car, it hasn't really let me down. Additionally, those fancy, you know, Fletcher and Mini Sport and all the different, you know, radiators that are made out of the aluminum are beautiful, don't get me wrong. And if my car was a later model Mini, I would definitely put it on there. However, I'll show you guys once the motor goes into the car why it can't fit exactly. But in short, there is a physical shroud welded onto the side of the inner wing on the Mark I Minis, and that prevents some of the kind of larger and fatter radiators from fitting in there. So if you have a Mark I Mini, keep an eye out for that. Now before this goes back on, I'm going to go ahead and actually reinstall the shroud on this radiator here. And on my Mark I have a 2-part shroud, and it's been powder coated. It was powder coated about 1.5 years ago, and it's starting to see a little bit of age, but I think it's just fine. This sits on the side with the actual nozzles on it, and it goes down like so on here, but the bottom side actually needs to go on first, and the top sits right over the top of that. Pretty straightforward. Now, there are holes along the side here that actually mount into the radiator, and the radiator, if you purchase it from 7 Mini Parts and Mini Parts suppliers, they will come with the bolts to mount it to the shroud, and then on top of that, sometimes it comes with a cap. Now, 9 times out of 10 though, this does not come with the radiator, so keep that in mind. If you need a radiator, you're going to need to pick up a radiator cap as well for it. So this is coming off the old radiator, and while we're putting this on here, we're going to want to take extra care bolting this up for a few reasons, and these are reasons that I've discovered on the last radiator I purchased. The actual captive nuts that sit down inside your radiator here, they have a tendency to come loose and strip, and we don't want that to happen. If I ever have to take this radiator out again, I want to make sure that it doesn't do that. But how can we prevent it from doing that? Well, simple, Loctite. This stuff is amazing. This one's made by Permatex. It's the same people who make my gasket sealer, and it's a thread locker. It's going to help prevent those bolts from rusting in there, but it's also going to hold those bolts in place, and then when I need to take them out, it should make it easier for me to take those out. So we just put a little bit of that thread locker on here, set that down, and then we are going to screw all of these in. Now, I'm going to do these all just hand tight because this 2-piece radiator shroud is a little temperamental sometimes, so we want to have a little bit of wiggle room while we're going through and tightening these down. Now, also, you aren't going to want to like blitz these on here. They don't need to be crazy tight. You just want them to be snug. Your radiator is, relatively fragile. It's something that has fins that can get bent and warped and torn. So just take your time, put these bolts back in here, and then I'll show you guys how to put this on the engine itself. All right, so now it's at this point things are getting a little exciting. This is kind of the last thing that I need to put on my motor here in order to get it ready for kind of dropping into the engine bay. Now, as you can see, my fan already connected, which I covered a little bit earlier in this video. The last thing that we're gonna do is take the now complete shroud and radiator setup, and we're actually gonna set it down on the stand that holds the radiator up and your actual engine mount to the subframe of the car here. This takes 2 half-inch bolts. We're gonna mount those up to the bottom, and then we're gonna finish up the thermostat on the top and connect everything kind of on the upper side of this radiator. Now this part's pretty important in that you want to make sure that these bolts are nice and tight and that they have a washer on them, because these are pretty difficult to get in and tighten or loosen once it's in the car. Additionally, if you've got this 2-piece radiator like I do, or realistically if you have a single-piece shroud, getting these bolts in now prior to the engine going in is something that you'll definitely want to take time and do, because these bolts are near impossible to tighten once it's in the car and it's kind of all bolted up. Now those 2 bolts are nice and tight, just like that, and the radiator will kind of sit there for right now. Now the last thing that we're going to do here, and the last thing I really want to call out to you guys, is this lower mount for your lower hose connection here on your radiator. As you can see, that slides right in there, and it's super easy to get to from the back side of the motor. But right here is where the bulkhead is in the back of the subframe, and this is really hard to get to when you are, when the motor's in the car. So what I like to do is make sure that I get a hose clamp that has like a flathead on it, Some people prefer a hex head on it. I prefer a flat head, and I want to make sure that this is pointing upwards. And what this is going to afford me when I do this here is it's going to help me access this in the future. Should I ever need to take this off for whatever reason, I'll be able to get in and access this hose clamp very easily with a long flathead screwdriver from the top of the motor. And there we have it. Nice, tight, and as you can see, the flathead mount is on the top, so I'll be able to reach my screwdriver right down in here to get to this. Now this screwdriver is not long enough, but you can get yourself a long screwdriver so you can reach down in there and it doesn't become a problem for you. So with that, the radiator is kind of loosely mounted right now. The next step is to get up to the top of the motor here and put our thermostat housing on, as well as our thermostat in our head. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to be doing is installing our thermostat. Now, our thermostat is a special device that allows water to pass by at a certain temperature. Now, the one that I've got here is made for 195 Fahrenheit. Now, if I remember correctly, the 195 is a great thermostat for here in the United States, where it gets really hot down where I'm at right now. This allows the motor to heat up, but it also allows the water to pass by kind of sooner so that it stays cool. And this sets in just like this with the spring facing down, and it should kind of lip in there, just nice and tight there. And something worth noting is that on some cars with this bypass valve here, with this bypass hose on the back side here that connects to the head, that allows water to pass by so pressure doesn't build up in your head. Now, later model cars that don't have that often have a hole drilled in the thermostat here. Now, I'm not sure if that comes from the factory or if that's what people do in order to prevent pressure from building up there, but it'd be worth checking and talking with your parts supplier to make sure that you get the right one for your car. Now, just like all my other gaskets, I apply a nice little helping of Permatex on this to help make that seal and stay nice and solid so this doesn't leak any coolant. And then I set this down, followed closely by the thermostat housing, and then I set the bracketry on top that connects to the radiator. So watch me here and I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. Now, one thing that I don't actually have with me right now, and it's the rubber grommets that go in these two nut holes right here, or these two bolt holes. Those are pretty important. That's something that you're going to want to have if you don't have it. I'm going to go ahead and put them in here now because those are very easy to replace later on. Put those on there once I get them. But for right now, we're going to go ahead and install this without those and come back to address it later here. All right, last but not least, we have our radiator cap. Go ahead and set that on there. Now, one other thing that I want to note on the early cars, this might surprise a lot of people, but this overflow right here for your coolant is there so that when your coolant starts to get pressurized, if it becomes overpressured, it's actually going to allow coolant to pass through this hose right here. And normally in a modern car, this goes to something called an expansion tank. Now, on early cars like mine, there was no such thing as an expansion tank. Once this became overpressured, it literally just dumped coolant directly out and onto the ground. Now, of course, we live in a world that is a lot more conscious about things like this. So in this build, I have plans to do a whole video on installing an expansion tank on an engine that doesn't have one. I have a really cool tank that I think is going to fit pretty nicely, but that'll be coming in a later video. For right now, I'm going to leave this hose off, just leave this exposed on the back, and I got to keep a note about this because when my car gets warm, it's going to want to dump that stuff out there when you first kind of get it all ironed out. So the Mark I has a self-leveling system, I like to call it, which basically means that once your car gets hot for the first time, if there's too much coolant in there, creating too much pressure, it's going to just push out the extra, kind of regurgitate it out onto the ground. This is not ideal. This is not what I would recommend. An expansion tank is something that you can install that doesn't really hurt the value of your car, and it only serves to help prevent damage to the environment and damage to the world around you. So next up, we've got to put this motor in. And I think I'm actually going to cap off the video right here. I know that this is going to probably piss off a few of you, But I'd like to spend kind of a whole episode talking about how to drop this in your engine bay, how to plug everything up and get it all connected for the first time. I think that that deserves its own video and its own kind of explanation. So, really excited about this. Let's head back into the shop. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up this episode of the Bad Wolf mini build and the engine rebuild portion of the Bad Wolf mini build. Pretty exciting stuff. There was some bumps in the road, as to be expected with this build. There have been quite a few bumps in the road. Hopefully that kind of wraps up the majority of the bumps, but let's be realistic, we know that's probably not the case. Now, the next episode of the Bad Wolf build, I'm hoping that I'm gonna get the engine back in the car, back where it should be, and really start to wrap up the engine portion of this project. I'm gonna show you guys how to connect up the drive shafts, connect up all of the kind of ancillary items that had to get disconnected when the motor came out, and then we can see what's left and kind of move forward from there. So as usual, a big thank you to my patrons who help support this channel and help fund big projects like this so I can share them with you guys. If you are interested in supporting the channel, head over to patreon.com/classicminidiy and check out the cool perks that I have up on Patreon. Next, a big thank you to 7 Mini Parts, especially with this engine portion of the build. They've helped me out so much with some of these parts, specifically the radiator, the bearings, all this stuff. If you're looking for classic mini parts and you're in North America, head over to the links in my description, which will show you guys all the parts that I used in this episode, and they have my affiliate portion on the end of those links, so if you use them to purchase any of those parts or any parts on their site, it actually gives me a little kickback so I can fund big projects like this. So, thank you so much, 7 Mini Parts. But aside from that, folks, that's it for this episode. So until the next one, enjoy those minis and motor on.